Welcome to today's event. My name is Julia Kowalski, and I am an assistant professor of global affairs at the Keough School of Global Affairs and a faculty fellow of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. The Liu Institute is one of 9 international institutes that make up the Keough School of Global Affairs. The Institute's main objectives are to coordinate Asian studies research and teaching across the university, to encourage Notre Dame students to study in Asia, to promote academic collaboration with Asian universities, and to organize public events pertaining to Asia. This academic year, the Institute is hosting a series titled Asian Revisions of Nation, State, and Citizenship that invites scholars from multiple disciplines to examine how diverse populations across Asia are remaking discourses and practices of nation, state, and citizenship, with consequences both for people in Asia and around the globe. On behalf of the Liu Institute and my fellow organizers of the series, Professors Kyle Jaros and Sharon Yoon, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Ravinder Kaur for today's lecture. I cannot think of a person whose research is better suited for the themes of our speaker series. Professor Kaur joins us from the University of Copenhagen, where it is 6 o'clock in the evening, and where she is Associate Professor of Modern South Asian Studies in the Department of Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies at the University of Copenhagen. She also directs the Center of Global South Asian Studies. Her work crosses disciplinary lines, touching on history, anthropology, and international politics, and she has been thinking about the politics of nationalism in post-colonial India for quite some time, beginning with questions about refugee resettlement and citizenship in the wake of partition, culminating in her first book since 1947, Partition Narratives Among Punjabi Migrants in Delhi, published by Oxford University Press. More recently, she has turned to shifts in conceptualizations of nation and economy in the wake of economic liberalization in the 1990s, culminating in her recent, very well-received book, Brand New Nation, Capitalist Dreams and Nationalist Designs in 21st Century India, published by Stanford University Press in the United States and HarperCollins Publishers in India. Throughout her scholarly career, Professor Kaur has focused on the role of intersecting themes of caste, class, gender, and inequality in conceptions of the nation via a very long list of scholarly publications, as well as many public-facing pieces of writing for journalistic venues around the world. During the event, which we'll turn things over to Professor Kaur in a minute, if you have any questions, please submit them using the questions and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will have time to address your questions after the talk, and we'll conclude at 1 p.m. South Bend time. And now, with great pleasure, I yield the floor to Professor Ravinder Kaur.
So thank you so much, Professor Julia Kowalski. I mean, it's a great pleasure for me to be engaging with you, and I'm so much looking forward to engaging with scholars at your university. I think without much ado, I'm going to begin by screen share here, if it is okay. And I think I'm going to begin with this image. In August 2021, the Indian Minister of Finance, Nirmala Sitharaman, announced the asset monetization policy that set out to raise 6 trillion rupees or $81 billion by leasing out public-owned infrastructure to private operators. This included brownfield projects, from roads, railway stations, train operations and tracks, airports, power transmission lines, hydroelectric and solar power, fiber and towers in the telecom sector, natural gas and petroleum pipelines, to assets in mining, shipping, warehousing, hospitality, stadia, and regional centers. Based on the philosophy of, I quote, creation through monetization, the policy aimed to unlock, I quote, value from public investment in infrastructure and tapping private sector efficiencies in operation and management of infrastructure, unquote. In short, the Indian nation was undergoing a spectacular monetization, that is, being turned into an income-generating asset through large-scale extraction of economic value. Now, this move was starkly was a starkly visible break from India's socialist past. Recall when Indira Gandhi undertook nationalization or the road to social control in 1969, she spoke of gaining, I quote, control over the commanding heights of the economy, particularly in a poor country where it is extremely difficult to mobilize adequate resources for development, unquote. The term commanding heights, as is well known, mobilized the Leninist vision of controlling critical infrastructure in a society. Now, about half a century later, the very commanding heights of the economy were being offered in the market economy. From post-colonial impulse to nationalization of capital, India had taken a decisive turn to its very opposite, the capitalization of the nation. How did India reach this point? In this presentation, I am going to trace the past and present genealogies of this shift. I begin with this image, which is simply called Open for Business. It's a well-known sign which is hung outside shops and commercial establishments, and it invites customers and patrons. But what does it mean when it is hung outside a nation? Do pay attention to the poster. It says Open for Business, ! www.incredibleindia.org. This is the official poster issued in 2002, inviting global businesses to come and invest in India. So basically, the question which arises is, how and when did India become an emerging market or an investment destination for global capital? Or what does it even mean for a nation to be imagined as a market? And what kind of politics has shaped and been shaped in return in the capitalization of the nation state? These are the questions which I'm going to address as what I call identity economy, which is the unlikely alliance between culture and capital, or taking cultural politics not as a sideshow to the domain of economy, but addressing the close alignments between identity politics and capitalist economy. It is a counterintuitive disclosure of how cultural identity in its commodity form is deployed to capitalize the nation, and in return, the potential capital gains are put to work to reconfigure the nation into a unified cultural entity. Of course, it wasn't always like that. And for that, I'm going to take you back into the moment of upheaval in 1990s. And before I proceed, a reminder that I use image as data in my project, and which in itself is a radical proposition, because data is often seen as something which constitutes of numbers, graphs. But here I'm going to show you a series of imagery, which I hope we can discuss later on as well. So the 1990s was a moment of fragile hope and anxiety in India. The nation had just opened up its economy to join the world of free markets, a post-Cold War, end of history world of global free markets. The formula proved seductive. It held out the promise of foreign investments, high economic growth, and of unleashing the arcade spirit of Indian enterprise. It also promised more consumer choices to Indian citizens, dream of a better life, and most of all, a chance to set the nation's course to resplendent 21st century futures. The forward march to market liberalization entailed a breakaway from India's old legacy of economic nationalism too. India's anti-colonial economics of Swadeshi, literally, of one's own nation or self-reliance. Swadeshi had dominated Indian economic policy and thinking since national independence, and it prioritized its autonomy over the nation's resources. The boycott of foreign-made goods was the most popular expression of Swadeshi politics. But in the 1990s, the Swadeshi began to be upended, even seen as a vestige of the past, holding back India from economic prosperity. So new Indian economic policy in 1990s threw open the consumer market to foreign goods. Swadeshi school economic thinkers termed it as the Coca-Colanization of India. Coca-Cola, in this dramatic transition to free market capitalism, at once became a sign of worldly pleasures now available to Indian consumers, as well as the treachery of selling out to foreign corporations. Recall that in 1977, Coca-Cola had been banned by the Indian state. The company was subsequently turned into a nationalist venture that sold an Indian brand of soft drinks. A quarter of a century later, Coca-Cola was not only back in the newly liberalized India, it had also brought the Indian brand to expand its operations in the market. The corporate sale of the Indian soft drinks brand to Coca-Cola was an illustration of how the logic of liberalization and globalization had displaced the principles of Swadeshi economic nationalism. The free market lobby, it was ruefully remarked, had sold out to big business and sullied India's anti-colonial dream of economic independence. Though the advocates of Swadeshi and socialists contested liberalization in the early 1990s, few had grasped the full consequences of India's transition to free market capitalism. At this point, the socialist and Swadeshi resistance aimed to prevent the opening of Indian consumer market to foreign goods or the foreign takeover of Indian companies. Yet, liberalization of India proved more than the question of consumer goods or companies. The nation state in the 21st century global economy was itself undergoing a capitalist transformation into a lucrative commodity, an enclosure of global capital. Already in the 1990s, India had begun courting foreign capital to rejuvenate its economy through global investment programs. What initially began as a push to sell made in India goods in global markets would soon turn into a Make in India project that sought to reconfigure India as a veritable factory of the world for global manufacturing. At the turn of the millennium, a historic publicity campaign, for example here, called India Shining, launched India as an investment hotspot in the global markets. The mediatized projection of India disclosed the inner workings of how India was being reorganized as a market. The campaign name India Shining was more than just a publicist hyperbole. It was an accurate description of post-colonial India's transition to capitalism. The shining metaphor promised India's great transformation, as you can see in this image, into a brand new nation, a refuge for global capital made available through state-led investment programs. The infusion of capital made India shine in the theater of world economy, a luster kept alive by profits the investors hope to generate. It entailed, too, a transformation of the nation into a fully capitalized income-generating asset, or in the language of policy experts, structural adjustments and lowering of trade barriers, all aided and abetted by global financial institutions and facilitated by the state. This move altered the old compact between nation and state. Once structurally adjusted, the nation became a site of production, its territory a reserve of untapped natural resources, its population a demographic dividend that both produced and consumed, and its culture a unique brand identity. The great state power rearranged the nation as a market-ready investment destination. The glue that bound the nation and the state together was an optimistic vision of economic growth and prosperity, which could erase the colonial shame, and even restoration of a mythical golden Hindu past, as we will see ahead. The past decade or so, the Indian nation brand identity has increasingly foregrounded an ancient Hindu past to fashion a unique cultural identity in the global economy. What began as a soft power push to overhaul India's image in the world in 1990s eventually became an instrument to strengthen the Hindu nationalist claims to represent the authentic pre-Muslim spirit of the nation. This ongoing transformation of the nation state provides yet another counterexample to the enduring myth of the extinction of the nation state in the flat world of free markets. Proponents long imagined globalization, that is shorthand for unrestrained mobility of capital, goods, people, and ideas, as a world in motion and open-ended market trade sans barriers, making national borders superfluous. The story of globalization itself has been told in the language of movements, flows, motions, networks, mobility, circulations, and fluidity, all to conjure a world permanently on the move. The India Shining imagery, and here's an iconic image from India Shining, discloses something often overlooked in the euphoria of globalization. That is, the nation state had not only defied the prediction of its end, it was undergoing a spectacular makeover to become a capitalist growth story in the global economy. The nation state in its commodity form was maintaining its role as a key actor despite predictions of its retirement. The transformation of the nation form raises the question, what does it mean to love the nation in its first century version? To ask the question already seems an aberration, almost a sacrilege, given the idea of the nation is at odds with commodification and market transactions. After all, the nation has long been imagined as a sacred object of worship, a dynamic moral spiritual project with a common history of love and suffering. The origins of the 19th century cultural nationalism lay in the imagination of nations as, I quote, organic beings or living personalities, unquote, that demanded sacrifice and devotion and, I quote, a special kind of love, unquote, that exceeded all others to sustain this virtual person. Nationalists presume the nation to be a unique person with inalienable civilizational essence and a timeless history, and its territory personified as a sacred being. To love the nation then was to celebrate the spirit of the people, the national romance that embraced natural landscapes and its ethnic inhabitants. The ultimate expression of nationalism was martyrdom for its cause. For Indians engaged in the anti-colonial struggle, the figure of the mother goddess, which is Bharat Mata, a feminine embodiment of India's territorial expanse, served as the sacred object of devotion and sacrifice. And just to say, if you look at it, almost in its modern version, here we have a divine feminine figure, except that this is in a cultural capitalist context, which is far removed from the 19th century nationalism. So the question is, how could the sacred nation be put at the disposal of investors in the marketplace? What does it mean for India to become a brand India which can be sold to global investors? The answer, I suggest, is counterintuitive. What renders the nation transcendental and open to exchange in the market is the imagination of the nation as a living organism, a unique being that can be dressed up as a branded investment destination. If the natural landscape is full of untapped natural resources and the people are consumers and producers, then the nation's cultural identity is turned into a corporate brand identity. So to love and be devoted to the nation then means to work to enhance the brand value and economic potential of the nation. It means adding value to the nation by projecting it as a profitable, market-ready investment destination. So what we witness is the logic of 19th century cultural nationalism, which is being turned upside down. Far from corroding the celebrated spirit of the nation, it's the nation's market value as a profit-generating commercial enclosure, which becomes a mode of affirming the worthiness of the people as a great nation. The more the brand new nation attracts and generates capital, more it legitimizes its aura, claims of essence, and identity as the chosen people with natural ties to the landscape. The infusion of capital continually generates something that far exceeds the capital, the aura, spirit, or the non-extractable difference that is plowed back to generate brand capital. In short, the cultural difference distilled into a corporate brand is put to work to generate more capital, and more capital in return enhances the claim of cultural uniqueness. The commodification of the nation consecrates too the very idea of state sovereignty in ever new forms. The visual power to celebrate the revitalized nation and to see and show the national territory and its population as valuable factors of production available to global capital. Now consider the Brand India publicity material, which mostly appears as a repackaging of the familiar cultural exotica. I have several images over here. For example, this one, which is also pretty well known. All of the cultural exotica, which ranges from yoga to wildlife to colorful festivals to Ayurveda, all dressed up in global aesthetics for its consumers in India and the world. Yet, what is crucial to this cultural politics of brand making is not just that what is inside the image frame, but what is kept outside of it. For example, the near absence of Muslim figures of symbols in the brand India imagery. It's an omission, an absence that creates a default Hindu cultural mainframe through which to see and show India. If there is an exception to this trend, it is the contentious presence of Taj Mahal. The 16th century Mughal monument built in Indo-Islamic style. On the cultural battlefield of Hindu nationalism, Taj Mahal is deemed a trace of the foreign, an inauthentic representation of India in the world. It is a permanent thorn in Hindu nationalist politics, but one that cannot easily be evicted from brand India. Consider how the monument is not only India's prime tourist destination, but also a World Heritage Site that generates steady profits. In a strange twist, then, it is not the secular politics of multiculturalism, but the capitalist logic of profit-making that allows the precarious presence of Taj Mahal within brand India. So the capitalist logic of brand India then extends beyond selling the nation to investors. It has not only furthered the Hindu nationalist agenda to create a unified cultural identity, it has also rearranged the social political landscape. Critical to this transformation is how brand making opens up a fractious politics of visual re-territorialization of the nation. Who are the chosen people who inhabit the visual surface of the nation brand? Which cultural practices and ideas are left out of the frame? It is not just what is inside. What is concealed and what is displayed in front of the world? Who owns the nation and its natural and cultural possessions? And who has the power to capitalize these possessions? If the visual frame of the nation brand is a form of public recognition of nation's cultural essence, then that unique difference acquires legitimacy precisely by being chosen for illumination by the state. For example, this is pretty telling. It is here that brand India imagery assumes significance. The predominant choice of pre-Muslim Hindu cultural practices in the image frame, which eventually become the cultural mainframe of the modern nation. The very act of illumination of cultural Hinduism as a symbol of modern India marginalizes all other religious groups and multicultural identity of post-colonial India. Witness how the idea of Hindu and India is increasingly conflated in public imagination. The secular and egalitarian roots of the old anti-colonial nationalism are giving way to unabashed Hindu nationalism that neither brooks dissent nor is willing to share power with the minority groups. It is hardly a surprise then that India's march to become the factory of the world, that is, a global space of production that contains natural resources, cheap skilled labor, technology, as well as a vast consumer market, is deeply entangled with pro-capital Hindu majoritarianism. At the heart of this alliance is the pursuit of economic growth, a project that calls for discipline, even obedience to the strongman leader who means business in more ways than one. This strongman appeal of Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, as a hyper-masculine leader is what first earned him endorsement of the captains of industry. The capital has indeed always rooted for authoritarian leaders who can not only capture resources and put them at the disposal of investors, but also ensure a permanent supply of good news to celebrate the growth story of the nation. This is where the domains of politics, economy, and publicity come together to shape the contours of pro-capital Hindu nationalism. The special kind of love for the brand new nation requires a steady channeling of positive, uplifting images in the global public sphere. It also means overlooking and countering negative images that might harm the nation's brand value in the world. This need for compulsory good news to keep optimism alive is at odds with the structures of democracy. After all, the heart of democracy is dissent, a practice that involves criticism, disagreement, and even expressions of disobedience. This contradiction has created a rupture and a new political category of dissidents through the logic of the brand, which everyone may have heard about, that is, the anti-nationals. The people who corrode the brand value of the nation by exposing the negatives, the communal violence, caste atrocities, and poverty, which otherwise remain buried beneath the good news. So these are some of the genealogies which I wanted to put forth, the shifts which have taken place from the pre-reform period into the reform, and the ways in which the new event of monetization of the nation is making a complete break from the past. I think I just wanted to make an outline looking forward to the discussions and commentary. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I think we can open things up to the Q&A. And again, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to dive in. It looks like I'll give people a moment or two. We did have a question that came in with the registrations that we could start with. And I'm sorry, I don't know who submitted this question and if that person is present, but we'll start with their question, which was asking if some of these dynamics around nationalism, national enclosure, also hold at the subnational level and within India, I assume.
I think that's a very, very good question. And thank you so much. I mean, first of all, I think we have to look at India literally as an enclosure which is made of sub-brands. Nearly every state within India has a brand, actually beginning with Vibrant Gujarat, which was started in 2003. And this is what some of the, I'm laying out, the correlation between cultural nationalism and brand making here. And then, of course, there is Happening Haryana, Passionate Punjab, UP upwards. I mean, there's a whole list, which is, with all adjectives like marvelous, amazing, incredible, and incredible is, of course, India. So states actually compete with each other. So from the old idea of federal cooperation, we have reached a point where it is federal competitiveness, where, Gujarat will compete with Bengal to take away, like Tata Nano is a very well-known example of how investments were pulled away. So I think this has to be remembered, that how India has been reshaped also internally, where competitions are held, the logic of the brand, where rankings are not just about nations on a world scale, but states ranked within India as well. And there are so many rankings, like Clean City or, Best Governed City, or from cities to regions, it's all ranked.
Thank you. I hope that answered the anonymous person who submitted that question before the talk. So again, I really encourage folks to drop in with questions as they have them. Since we're still waiting to hear from other audience members, I will use my kind of host's prerogative to ask a question, which is that I'm really curious to hear more about how you're thinking about this concept of enclosure. And I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll limit myself. So one is that I was really interested in this idea that part of what's being enclosed is not just the sort of cultural representation of the nation, but also a kind of affective orientation to the nation, that the proper citizen loves the nation, that they broke no critique, it's always good news all the time. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what it means to think of that kind of affective stance as something that can be a target of enclosure, and how that creates value and for whom.
I think I have to say that the word enclosure I use, basically I'm mobilizing an old, history, which is namely the making of, turning the commons into uncommons, or the making of the private sphere. And enclosure, as everyone knows, is something which is associated with the whole push towards private property in England, especially the enclosure movement of farmland, right? The commons being turned into private farmland. And but the other thing which I'm drawing attention to is that it was not just inwards, but it was also outwards, because it's in the same period that we also witnessed, free trade imperialism or colonialism, where new colonies, entire, regions, like different continents are literally being colonized and turned into, enclosures of production. And so there are so many examples about that. So I think it is this genealogy I try to weave through when I reimagine that, it is not altogether like, that it's not altogether new that in 21st century, actually, we have a reimagination of the nation as a commercial enclosure. Actually, already in the beginning of the 19th century, there are, there's actually a text which literally is almost like laying out the blueprint of such a happening, namely the state as, the closed commercial state, where, and you're totally right, once you begin to imagine the nation as an enclosure, to run a successful factory, you also need discipline. And the discipline here comes not in the forms that we are used to, but in an effective way. For example, one idea that we need to remain positive and to be upbeat and optimistic and to celebrate. And you may have noticed in the last few years, there's one thing which is very peculiar about Indian politics, that spectacle has become a very huge part of it. Like there are a lot of new rituals, new celebrations which are being created. So in a way, this celebratory mood, uplifting mood in itself becomes a tool of disciplining. Because people who are, not celebrating, like the naysayers, so in a way, they are nobody wants to be the party spoiler. And this precise idea of celebration goes against the very foundation of democracy, where you are, where dissent is part of the order. So I think this kind of contradiction that we see in Indian politics can only be explained by this push, to this, multiple levels of enclosures which are being created in the nation state.
Wonderful, thank you. So now we've got a nice queue of questions that have rolled in. So I'll start with a question from my colleague and co-organizer of this series, Kyle Jaros, who is a scholar of contemporary China. And he says, thank you for a fascinating and provocative lecture. The branding selling of the nation in India takes on a particular resonance given the historical context you have described, but how unique is this phenomenon in comparative perspective? Have you investigated parallels in other national settings, especially other post-colonial settings?
Of course, it's not unique at all. I mean, it is absolutely not, the fact that you removed the question, but I think the question is basically that, is it just India or is it also other post-colonial settings, like selling the nation? Literally, I begin my book, on the promenade, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where literally the whole street is lined up with commercial establishments where Brazil, South Africa, Thailand, or Malaysia, or even Azerbaijan, or you just name it. Literally, these are nations lined up, and most people who are unused to, this place, they would wonder what on earth is being sold here. And then you figure out that these are investment promotion boards or, publicity departments, which are literally sitting over there, handing out brochures, welcoming. Literally, this is a place where you make, state bureaucracy, officials, ministers, come and meet with prospective investors. So there is nothing unusual that India is doing that, but there is one thing which is specific about India, that India is a very major player, and it was very early in the game, and it almost became like a blueprint for many other states to follow. And here's a surprising little bit, which is that many Indian advertising agencies literally do the work for many foreign governments, because the Indian campaigning became so successful. So you'll be surprised. I don't want to name, but there are many, countries which literally deploy, like they employ, Indian ad agencies to do this work. So in a way, you would say that, yes, there is nothing unusual, but India is the trendsetter in this business.
So I'll turn here to a question from another colleague here at Notre Dame, Nikhil Menon, who's a professor of history. So Nikhil asks, again, thanks you for joining us, and asks, I was wondering if you could talk about how something like Modi's demonetization fits into your narrative. And that's for folks who maybe are coming from outside South Asia studies. I'll let you explain it in your answer. And so Nikhil goes on to ask, is it an example of strongman decisive politics? And was there an aspect of that move that had an international audience? Perhaps Modi's anti-corruption as a way to game things like the World Bank's ease of doing business rankings?
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, this is a great question because, when we mention monetization, so of course we have to talk about demonetization because that was the other side of the story. But of course, these were not the same, processes really. But what is important in what you're saying is that this actually was an example, demonetization, of where, economic decision-making literally became a popular theater. And this is an example where you could see, that most people do not understand what precisely withdrawal of currency notes was going to do. I mean, we all learned in a few months, like literally people are standing outside in the queue. But what was very important is that even though everyone with the understanding of economics, they were saying, this is a very bad decision. This is, this is literally going to, break Indian economy. But there was a particular kind of populist euphoria within the population. Public is standing in the queues, but they're still, saying, but this is okay. And this is where I think we must remember, that how the whole public theater or public spectacle has become a form of governance in the last few years as well. And what I mean by that is that people got drawn into a theater, even though, when you're standing in the bank queues, you're literally performing a part in that scheme where the narrative that this is going to root out, this is an anti-corruption move, it is going to, do away with black money, or it is going to teach a lesson to the rich people. This is literally where we see that, expert, monetary policy, for example, literally gets translated in the popular sphere in this way. So I think in that sense, totally, and especially the most important thing, the hallmark of these announcements is that Mr. Modi actually just does it very swiftly with a 3.5 hour notice or something like that. And as you know, like people often talk about that when there is an announcement at 8 o'clock, there's going to be a national address, that people await this kind of, a big bang kind of news that something is going to change. So yes, I totally, I actually agree with the question, which is like this literally, I think the strong man image, because it's not about, carefully thought out schemes like a bureaucrat would do, but this is where a political leader who takes swift decisions, good or bad, this is what, carves a constituency as well. But I'm not so sure about the second part of the question, which is that, this was literally to game the ease of doing business World Bank ranking. But of course, there is a whole debate about that, but I'm not sure demonetization precisely fitted into that in the sense that, of course, it had a global it was part of the global debate because, as everyone knows, there is some literature, economic literature, which says that we must have fewer higher currency note. But like even the authors of the report later said that they had never imagined or anything like this. So therefore, I would say the global side of things is perhaps this was more directed towards domestic audience.
We have another question in the queue, but I'm going to kind of two-finger just to build on Nikhil's question to ask about whether you would see some of the decisions that were made around a response to the COVID pandemic as also falling into this governance by spectacle, like thinking about the kind of immediate lockdowns that put maybe millions of people on the road to go back home. I mean, that was also spectacular. In a way, it was a spectacle. So is that a similar kind of governance by spectacle, or is that a different category of like public health crisis, panic?
But I think I think this needs to be written totally, completely. Like literally in the last few years, spectacle has appeared as a form of governance in India. And what I mean by that is like COVID offers you an excellent example because it offers you a unique comparative frame because COVID is unfolding all over the world, right? So here we had actually, state-inspired or state-sanctioned rituals, public rituals, which were being done. I think already, now I might be remembering the dates incorrectly, but I think it was 24th March or something like, or a couple of days before we had this Janta curfew, which literally had, which came with a prescription that we need to, light, diyas, the light basically, earthen lamps, and then you need to have some kind of rituals, like you have to stand and applaud, and and that was one part of the story, and everybody was encouraged. So if as a resident you were not doing that, then neighbors would take note of it. So that is also in a way a disciplining tool, right? And then I think few days later, again, the idea that you need to sing and or praise or thank the staff, that was also very much a public ritual. Now the difference, please recall that in Italy, for example, like people were standing in the balcony and singing also, and that actually became the inspiration for public rituals. I think in England, NHS was being thanked with public clapping every week or something. The difference between what was happening in India and in other parts of the world of similar nature is that governments were not involved. So in this case, literally, it was a very well-organized, event in a way, which was also publicized by the, activists, political activists on the ground. So I think this is where one sees that, the public performative side of things, that has taken like a lot of, it holds a lot of ground in India.
Well, thank you. I can really see how the image as method is really helpful for thinking through these issues too. So we have a question, a long-standing question from Abdul Malik Badamasui, who says, impressive historical perspective, thank you. I wish you could comment on India's next step facing the Commonwealth model and American global leadership and market access.
But I'm not sure I understood the Commonwealth model and the American global. Oh, you mean, I'm not 100% sure. What does it mean?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. And Abdul Malik, if you're still with us, you could clarify in the Q&A as well.
Because does it mean like India taking some sort of global leadership position, or? But I think in that sense, maybe one could say that, of course, I think there are two things in this, if that is the idea about India attaining some sort of global leadership. One is an internal logic, and the other is an external logic. Just a minute. There is a Commonwealth model alliances. Okay. I mean, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, of course, there is this, great desire that India should become a world leader. And sometimes it is expressed in the form of, Vishwaguru, the world leader. And so there is an internal desire. And the other thing is that often you see that, the Western countries often say, oh, well, like policymakers, but why doesn't India take a more proactive role? And it is primarily in relation to China, as a bulwark against China, as the Asian leader, like an Asian neighbor. And also because India and China, are the only two countries which are comparable, in size and scale. So I think this doubleness, and I think I won't say Commonwealth kind of alliances, but there is a new network of alliances which are literally in the post-pandemic world. They are being created, erased, reconfigured as we speak. Already in the past 1 year, we have seen how different kinds of potential new alliances are being forged, and some are already going out of fashion as we speak. So it's a very fascinating phase for those who follow global politics. that how, like from, Indo-Pacific to AUKUS to Quad 1 to Quad 2, how things are evolving as we speak, and they're already fading out. So I think lots is happening, and we will see in the next year or so where it leads.
Fantastic. So again, I just want to encourage our audience, if you have questions, please share them with us in the Q&A slot. We have a two-part question that I thought we could maybe break into two questions from Devabata Chakraborty. So first, Devabata, again, thanks you for your fascinating talk, and says, I have not read your book as yet, so not sure if you address it there, but I'm curious about your theoretical influences. You draw from Marxist political economy. Has Weber's Protestant ethic also influenced your thought? It felt like there were so many parallels between what you say and what Weber wrote. We'll come back to the second part of the question maybe, but that's already quite a large question.
Yeah, I mean, the more, because, about how, like, I would just like to hear more if there is, like about the theoretical influences. Well, certainly I draw from the Marxist political economy, but I also go beyond that. And I think it's primarily because I think when we speak about something, the domain of political economy, then the focus is so much on materiality or the material infrastructures that something very important is almost overlooked. And that is what I'm trying to bring in, the intersections, between materiality and, the spirit, affect, or the invisible, or let's say that, something like in 1980s, a lot of people used to speak about ideology. No one talks about it anymore. And so something did take place where things went out of sync, between the, so everything became about, in 1990s, during the Clintonian era in US, it became very popular to say that politics boils down to something called the economy. It's the economy, stupid. If that was it, then our world we cannot explain our world. And this is the position where we are in, because, the most appropriate example is India. Indian economy, as everyone knows, has a kind of stalled, from being at the very top at some point, like the world's fastest growing democracy. That was a slogan launched in 2006. Then it became Fragile Five, part of the Fragile Five, and it continues to struggle. Of course, there are always optimistic predictions, but it doesn't still make it. Let's see. But the important thing is, if we were to explain this kind of, this out of sync, between complete political domination and fragile economy, how are we to do that? So I think this is where I would say that purely by looking at the materiality or the material side, we do not explain how the world works. So this, at least, is my attempt to make a crossover. It is only by bringing together these two different worlds together that we can make sense of it.
So I want to turn to the second part of Devadatta's question, which is about methods, and I'm gonna staple one of my questions onto this as well, which I hope is okay. So Devadatta asks, could you talk a little bit about the methodology of the book? You indicated using visuals as data. Very curious to hear more. And I would add to that, we're a very interdisciplinary audience, as we always are here at the Liu Institute. And at the beginning of your talk, you discussed using images as data rather than numbers. And I wondered if you could maybe expand on what you think using this visually, it's not just visually driven, but this visually driven, narrative driven approach adds to your take on the nation state that we wouldn't be able to see if we were just looking at data sets. And so I'm sorry, I don't want to co-opt Devadatta's question, which is about the methodology of the book as well.
So thank you so much for asking, because this is so important, because this is what makes, the work that I've been doing pretty different and also in the beginning difficult to understand. Like, when I started presenting it in conferences and workshops, I think a lot of people were just surprised, but how can you work on economy or the economic side of things if you don't use, charts, statistics, Gini coefficient, and all those like explanatory devices. So I think here's the thing. When I said I use image as data, I am not just speaking about, first of all, I'm not just speaking about images as in photographs or artwork. So I'm speaking about, in a broad way, I'm speaking about image also as an idea. Image is also an idea, and in image is also visuality. So it is combining, first of all, that frame. And number two, when I say it is data, I mean data like bits of information, right? Which can be consumed. So here's the thing, that when we speak about something called the economy, it is often seen as the domain that experts inhabit. And it's a very specialized kind of domain, which you can only understand if you know the language of economics, to read those analyses. And which all works fairly well when you're sitting in a policy institute talking to other experts. But if you were to explain to the masses, mostly they're not trained economists, the public that votes for you. And you want to tell them that what does economic growth, how would India look like if we, took the path of economic growth? This is where I think, infrastructures of mass publicity, or basically what I'm calling the great spectacle in my book. And I purposely do that because I'm trying to, in a way, engage with the whole idea of the great transformation, which is literally about making those structural changes. So what I'm saying is that, the spectacle, the image has been completely overlooked, because when you want to communicate, publicize the idea to the public, which is not literally outside the, rooms, policy expert rooms, how do you do that? And this is where this publicity material becomes extraordinarily valuable. And most of it is discarded because it is seen as propaganda issued by, some government, etc. But it is precisely here that we get an insight into how the elite of the nation think. How do they imagine, that the nation, not just that, it's basically laying out the dream. And there is nothing unusual about it. I mean, in the sense like 100 years ago, such kind of dream worlds were being chalked also, but in socialist terms. I mean, the Russian Revolution, actually that unleashed a whole new imagination of how the world could look like. So the difference here is that here we are, chalking up the capitalist dream worlds where economic growth. I mean, the image that I showed you, it's an iconic image of, the new mother, the Indian mother in yellow sari, the one who's enjoying the fruits of economic growth, right? So I think this is where I'm sorry for a very long answer, but I think it is so important, that we begin thinking, of data itself, or what we think as data, in much broader terms.
Yeah, thanks. That's fantastic. And it's so interesting to think too about like I'm jumping in. We have another question in the queue, so I'll be brief. But I think one of my favorite recent books in the social sciences is Michelle Murphy's book, The Economization of Life, which is also asking about how people come to feel the economy as a kind of container. And she uses the metaphor of like the bottle that held the fruit flies that were first used to do these population experiments. And it's I see such a resonance with that. And the kind of image, feeling the frame of the image and what it excludes and what it encloses is a way of learning to feel the economy. It's really provocative. Thank you so much. So we have another question from our colleague, Alexander Shu in the Liu Institute and the Ansari Institute. He says, thank you for your talk. Could you speak about what branding strategies one of the minor political parties, neither Congress nor BJP, so we're back at the subnational question again too, what one of the minor political parties might pursue were they to take power? Do alternative political visions that they offer take aim at dominant parties' tourism and advertising campaigns?
No, this is a very good question. Thank you so much. I mean, all the questions have been fantastic. It allowed me to just explain things that I so badly wanted to talk about. I think this question about party politics and how do political parties, how they shape vision. I mean, one thing I have to say is that in my own work, I have, brought focus to a lot of people who are not necessarily politicians. And that's literally, I want to emphasize that. Many of these operations are seen as expert domains, right? And where politicians actually tend to listen to them. So there's a very interesting thing that, from mid-1990s onwards, the journey of all this image making, the enclosure making already begins in 1990s. And as you know, there have been various parties in power through that period. And it is in 1996 that the first time, mid-90s, that the budget for image making or creating a strong brand for India that is instituted. And Congress governments, BJP governments, there is a change. It continues happening. But there is some sort of consistency which has shaped, and which is what we need to notice. How does that happen? And this is where I'm trying to bring focus on a group of people I call nation branders. So, when you think about makers of modern India, I mean, you all think about the big political leaders, the big ideas which are brought to work. But what we witness here is a different kind of field, which is basically an interaction between politicians, bureaucrats, policymakers, experts, and of course, the advertisers. And the fun part, or the interesting part, is that a lot of them would call themselves apolitical people who love the nation, that they're neither doing it for money, nor doing it because of any political affiliation. They often in interviews, they would try to put themselves above commodification, above politics. And so this was one thing where, this group of people that I'm calling nation branders, that they would position themselves as nationalists, that they are doing it for pure love of the nation. On the other hand, you have politicians or the bureaucrats, government employees. They would often, the smart ones among them, they would always be, prefaced as CEOs. Look, he's in the government, but he almost works like a CEO. So I slowly realized that CEO was nothing. It's not, a title that you use. It's not an official title, but it is almost like an honor. That when you say XYZ works like a CEO, basically what it means is that the corporate ethics of working, have seeped through. So I think it is a long answer again, but what I'm trying to say is that we do not witness, a shift in politics over here, in this brand politics, along, so much about, when Congress, BJP come and go. But what we witness is a different kind of politics which continues emerging, which is as much technocratic, bureaucracy or economic experts and publicists all brought together.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are just about out of time if we're going to be respectful and end at 1 o'clock, as we said that we would. So I just want to end by thanking Professor Kaur for taking the time to talk about her work with us. And we'll look forward to what comes next. This lecture series on Asian revisioning of the nation state will continue next semester. This is our last talk in the series this semester, but next semester we'll pick up again with talks by Diane Fu, Radhika Govindrajan, and Elena Kim. So more information is available at asia.nd.edu. So thank you again to the Liu Institute for hosting this talk, and to my colleagues Kyle and Sharon for co-organizing, and thanks to Professor Kaur and our many audience members.
And thank you so much for hosting this. It was a great pleasure to talk to everyone.